My name is Iris Ashford. I'm 31 now. Software engineer, small company founder, the kind of person who shows up early and stays late. But when I was 9 years old, my parents drove me to a horse ranch in eastern Oregon and left me on the porch with a plastic suitcase. My grandfather, Henry Ashford, stood in the doorway and watched their car disappear down a gravel road. He didn't wave. Neither did they. 10 years later, those same parents showed up at his funeral in pressed black suits, talking about family, talking about fairness, talking about $100 million they believed was rightfully theirs. But here's what none of them knew. Grandpa had already signed everything. And when the lawyer opened that document in front of a room full of witnesses, my mother's face went from entitled to ashen in about 4 seconds flat. I'll get there. But first, let me take you back to the day they left me behind. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where quiet people meet loud betrayals and walk out steadier than they came in. If family and money ever taught you a lesson you didn't ask for, this one's going to land. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. It was August. I remember that because the air smelled like dried grass and hot fence wire, and my sneakers stuck to the vinyl backseat of my father's Buick. We'd been driving for 6 hours from Portland, and nobody had said a word to me since the gas station in Bend. My mother, Diane, sat in the front seat scrolling through a magazine. My father, Glenn, drove with one hand on the wheel and the other tapping the armrest like he was counting down the minutes until he could be somewhere else. When we pulled onto the gravel road that led to Ashford Stables, my mother finally turned around. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, at the suitcase. "You'll have your own room," she said. "Grandpa's got a big house." That was the pitch. That was the entire explanation for leaving your 9-year-old daughter with a 70-year-old man she'd met twice at Christmas. Glenn carried my suitcase to the porch and set it down like he was dropping off a package. He didn't kneel. He didn't hug me. Diane stayed in the car with the engine running, window cracked 2 inches. I stood on the bottom step and looked back at her. She met my eyes for half a second, then looked at Glenn and said something I barely caught through the glass. I heard enough. She was the one we could afford to lose. The Buick backed out. Gravel popped under the tires, and the only sound left was the creak of the old windmill behind the barn, turning slow and steady in the August heat, like it had been turning long before I got there and would keep turning long after everyone forgot I existed. I stood on that porch for a while, long enough for the dust to settle and the Buick to vanish past the tree line. Then the screen door opened behind me, and there was Henry Ashford, 6'1", white hair buzzed short, wearing a chambray work shirt with grease under his fingernails. He didn't crouch down to my level. Didn't ask if I was okay. He looked at my suitcase, then at me, and said, "Can you carry that yourself?" I nodded. "Good. Your room's at the top of the stairs, second door. Drop it off, then meet me in the workshop." No hug, no cookie, no pep talk about how everything was going to be all right. Just a direction and a job. I dragged the suitcase upstairs, shoved it in a room that smelled like cedar and old wool blankets, and walked back down. The workshop was behind the main barn, a long concrete-floored room lined with pegboard walls and hand-labeled tools, wrenches hung by size, socket sets in order. Everything had a place and a reason. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Saddle leather and machine oil, layered deep into the wood and concrete like the building itself was made of work. Henry was standing at a bench, holding a bridle with a broken buckle. He pointed to a stool next to him. "Sit." I sat. "Watch." I watched. He didn't explain what had gone wrong with my parents. He didn't promise things would get better. He just fixed the buckle, slow and precise, and when he was done, he handed me a rag and said, "You'll work. Working is how you stop drowning." That was my welcome to Ashford Stables. Henry taught me how to use a torque wrench before he taught me how to make scrambled eggs. That first week, I learned to tighten a bolt to spec. Not too loose, not stripped. "Feel it catch," he said. "That's where the metal wants to stop. You go past that, you break what you're trying to hold together." He said things like that. Short sentences with a second meaning hiding behind the first one, and he never pointed out the second meaning. You either caught it or you didn't. By the second month, I was helping him repair fence posts and recalibrate the irrigation pump. By the third, he let me use the welding torch. Supervised, gloves, and mask on, but real work. He never talked about my parents. Not once. If I brought them up, he'd pause, then redirect. Hand me the 3/8 socket. Go check the water trough in paddock 2. It wasn't cruelty. It was a decision. He was teaching me that I could build a day without them in it. One evening, I was watching him sketch a modification for the barn ventilation system. Clean lines, precise dimensions, the kind of drawing that belonged in an office, not a ranch. And I noticed the ring on his right hand. Iron, not gold. Thick band, worn smooth on the outside, with something etched into the inner surface I couldn't read. "What's that ring?" I asked. He looked at it like he'd forgotten it was there. "My father's." "What's it for?" He turned it once around his finger, keeping a promise. Then he picked up his pencil and went back to drawing. "You don't inherit a thing, Iris. You earn the right to keep it." I didn't understand what he meant. I would. I didn't know what my grandfather was worth until years later. To me, he was a man who fixed things and went to bed by 9. But Henry Ashford had been a mechanical engineer for 32 years before he retired to the ranch. He held patents, 14 of them, on irrigation valve systems used by agricultural operations across the western United States. The royalties alone were substantial, but he never talked about money. He drove a 20-year-old Ford truck. He bought his clothes at the feed store in town. The ranch itself sat on 1,100 acres of high desert grazing land with water rights that dated back to the original homestead deed in 1923. Ashford stables ran 37 horses, mostly quarter horses, a few warm bloods, and the operation broke even on boarding fees and training sessions. But the land underneath it, combined with the patent portfolio, was worth a figure I wouldn't have believed if you'd told 9-year-old me. Henry never mentioned it. The only sign was the way people in town treated him, not with deference exactly, but with a kind of quiet respect that went beyond neighborliness. The hardware store owner called him Mr. Ashford. The county clerk returned his calls the same day. The vet drove out on weekends when a horse needed checking. I thought that was just how small towns worked. I didn't realize it was how small towns worked when one man had been quietly holding the economic floor for 2 decades. The man who ate canned soup for dinner 3 nights a week was sitting on $100 million in land and intellectual property, and the people who dumped me at his door had always known it. The years pass the way they pass on a working ranch. In seasons, not semesters. I learned to shoe a horse at 12, rebuilt the south fence line at 13. At 14, Henry and I took apart the windmill behind the barn, the same one whose creak had been the last sound I heard the day my parents left, and we rebuilt it from the base plate up. New bearings, new blades, rebalanced rotor. Henry showed me how to calculate wind load, how to account for metal fatigue in the shaft housing, how to test the pump action at different RPMs. It took us 3 weekends. When we finished and the blades caught the first gust, that creak was gone, replaced by a smooth, steady hum. I stood there listening to it and felt something I didn't have a word for. Henry did. That's the sound of something working the way it's supposed to. The workshop was where I spent my evenings. While other kids my age were on their phones, I was learning to read engineering schematics and solder circuit boards. The smell of that room, saddle leather and machine oil, became the smell of home, not the house, the workshop. That's where Henry was most himself, and where I became most myself. He taught me drafting. He taught me to code on a second-hand laptop. He taught me that frustration is just a signal you haven't found the right angle yet. And he never once said, "I'm doing this because your parents left." He just showed up every day, same shirt, same ring, same steady hands, and worked beside me until the thing was fixed. No speeches about resilience. No inspirational quotes. Just work. Done right. Done together. My parents called maybe 4 times a year. Christmas sometimes. My birthday. if they remembered. The calls followed a pattern. Diane would ask Henry how the ranch was running, whether the insurance was current, whether the property taxes were under control. She never asked me what grade I was in. Glenn would get on the line for 30 seconds and say something like, "You being good for your grandpa?" The kind of question that doesn't want an answer. Then there was my 15th birthday. Diane had called the week before and promised, her word, that she and Glenn would drive out for the weekend. "We'll bring Brian too," she said. "He wants to see the horses." Brian was my older brother. 3 years older than me, the one they kept. I hadn't seen him since I was 9. I cleaned the guest room. Henry didn't say anything, but he bought a cake from the bakery in town, which was the most he'd ever done for any occasion. The day came. No car on the gravel road, no call until 6 in the evening, when Diane left a voicemail, not even a live call, saying Glenn's business meeting ran long and they'd try for next month. They didn't try for next month. I sat on the porch with a slice of cake I didn't eat and watched the sun go down behind the barn. Henry came out, stood next to me, and didn't say a word for a long time. Then I heard him on the phone inside, and his voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "Don't promise that girl something you won't deliver. You do it again, don't call here." He hung up. That was the most I ever heard him say about my parents. I graduated from the high school in town with a 3.9 GPA and a full scholarship to Oregon State for mechanical engineering. Henry drove me to campus in the old Ford. He carried one of my bags to the dorm room, set it inside the door, and looked around the small cinder block room like he was running a structural assessment. "Ceiling's fine," he said. "Outlets are grounded. You'll be all right." That was his version of a goodbye speech. We walked back to the truck. I hugged him. The first time I'd initiated a hug in 9 years, and he was stiff with it. The way tall men sometimes are when they don't know where to put their arms. Then he coughed. A deep, wet cough that came from somewhere in his chest I didn't like. "You okay?" "Dust," he said. "Ranch dust. Go learn something." He drove away, and I stood in the parking lot watching the Ford get small on the highway. The last thing I saw before it disappeared over the hill was the faint glint of that iron ring on his right hand, resting on the steering wheel. I threw myself into engineering the way Henry had taught me. Find the problem, break it into parts, solve each part, test the whole. The work felt natural, like muscle memory from all those evenings in the workshop. But 2 months in, the phone calls started telling a different story. Henry's voice was thinner every week. The coughs lasted longer. He'd wave it off. Just the dust. But I knew dust didn't sound like that. By October, I was calling every 3 days. By November, I stopped pretending it was normal. Something was wrong, and he wasn't going to tell me until it was too late. I came home at winter break, 4 months into my freshman year, and knew immediately. The ranch was running, but it was running slower. Gates that Henry would have fixed in a day were held shut with baling wire. The barn roof had a new leak he'd covered with a tarp instead of replacing the flashing, and Henry himself had lost 20 pounds he didn't have to spare. He was 78. The cough had become a permanent resident in his chest, a low, rolling thing that bent him at the waist when it hit hard. I didn't ask his permission. I moved back into my old room and started catching up on deferred maintenance. Replaced the barn flashing. Rehung the south gate. Rewired the workshop lights that had been flickering for months. And every time I fixed something, I felt the old rhythm come back. The two of us working side by side, except now I was the one holding the wrench steady while he pointed. My competent weakness showed up right on schedule. I did everything myself. I didn't call a ranch hand for help. I didn't hire a part-time nurse. I didn't phone a friend or a professor or anyone. Because I'd learned at 9 years old that the people who were supposed to help you would leave, so you handled things alone. Henry noticed. "You don't have to fix everything in 1 week," he said one morning from his chair on the porch. "I'm not fixing everything," I said. "I'm fixing what's broken." He looked at me over his coffee. "Same thing I said at your age. Didn't work out any better for me. I know some of you are already thinking about a person who raised you when they didn't have to. Hold on to that. If this story is hitting close, Comment one word, who, and subscribe, because the part that changed everything is still ahead. By September, Henry was spending most of his time in the recliner by the living room window, where he could see the barn and the pastures and the line of mountains to the east. He was still sharp enough to correct my weld technique from across the room by listening to the arc. But his body was done cooperating. One evening, I brought him soup and sat on the floor next to his chair, the way I used to sit on the stool in the workshop. "Grandpa, we need to talk about the ranch." "No, we don't. If something happens to you, it's handled." He said it the way he said everything, flat, final, like a bolt torqued to spec. Then he added, "There's a woman named Marion Voss, attorney in Bend. When the time comes, she'll contact you. Everything you need is with her." "What does that mean?" "It means you don't have to worry about it." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer you're getting." He reached over and patted the arm of my chair. "Henry's version of a long embrace. I set it up years ago, Iris. You'll see how it works. Just trust the paperwork." I wanted to push. I wanted details, documents, a plan I could audit. That's how my brain worked. The engineering brain he'd built. But something in his voice told me this was one system he'd already tested, and my job was to let it run. So I dropped it. I sat there in the quiet, listening to the pump in the irrigation system cycling on and off, and I let it be enough. I didn't know then what it was. I wouldn't know for months. But Henry Ashford had spent his entire life building things that held up under pressure, and this would be no different. It was a Thursday night in October when Henry told me about the ring. We were in the workshop, him on the old wooden chair I'd dragged in so he could sit while I finished rewiring the breaker panel. The smell of saddle leather and machine oil hung in the air the way it always did, thick and warm, like the room was breathing. He held up his right hand and turned the ring slowly under the work light. "My father wore this ring for 41 years, he said. He was a machinist in Salem, built parts for the sawmills. When he retired, he gave it to me and said one thing: keep what matters, let the rest go." The ring was iron, not decorative, functional metal, the kind you'd use for a bearing sleeve. The outside was worn smooth from decades of work, but inside the band, etched in small block letters, was an inscription. I leaned in close. A date, March 14th, 1962, and 2 words: Ashford Keeps. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means what it says," Henry replied. "The Ashfords keep their word. They keep what they build, and they keep the people who show up." He slid the ring off his finger and held it up between his thumb and forefinger. It caught the light, dull and heavy. "When the time comes, this goes to the person who earned it." He put the ring back on. "Not the person who asks for it." He picked up a pencil and started sketching something on the pad beside him. Always sketching, always designing, even at 78 with lungs full of fluid. I watched his hand move across the paper, the ring glinting with every stroke. "You don't inherit a thing. You earn the right to keep it." I was starting to understand what he meant. Henry died on a Tuesday in November, 2 days before the first snow. I was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard the silence. Not a sound. The absence of one. The cough that had been his constant companion for months had stopped. I walked to the living room and found him in his recliner, eyes closed, face calm, one hand resting on the arm of the chair and the other in his lap. The window was open an inch, and through it came the creak of the windmill. Slow, rhythmic. The same creak I'd heard the day I arrived at 9 years old. The same creak that had scored every important moment on that ranch. Except now it sounded different. Now it sounded like a door closing. I sat on the floor next to his chair for a long time. I didn't cry, not because I was strong, but because Henry had spent 10 years teaching me that grief is something you carry, not something you perform. When I finally stood up, I reached for his right hand and slid the ring off his finger. It was warm. The inscription inside caught the light from the window. March 14th, 1962, Ashford Keeps. And I remembered what he'd said in the workshop. When the time comes, this goes to the person who earned it. His last instruction to me had been simpler. 3 nights before he died, when his voice was barely above a whisper, he'd pressed the ring against my palm and said, "Keep it where they can see." I didn't understand what that meant. Who was they? Why did it matter if they could see it? I put the ring on my right hand. It was too big, so I wore it on my thumb. And then I called the funeral home. The obituary ran in the Harney County paper on Thursday. By Friday morning, my mother called. I hadn't spoken to Diane in almost 2 years. The last time had been a voicemail she'd left asking Henry if his tax situation allowed for a loan. She hadn't even addressed it to me. Now here she was, voice pitched low and soft, the grief performance tone I would come to recognize very well over the next few days. "Iris, sweetheart, we just heard about Daddy." Daddy? She called him Daddy when she wanted something. The rest of the time he was your grandfather, or Henry, or nothing at all. "The funeral's Saturday," I said. "We're coming." "Of course we're coming. Glenn and Brian too. We wouldn't miss it." She paused. I could hear Glenn in the background saying something about a flight. Then Diane added, so casually it almost slipped past, "Has anyone talked to you about the estate yet?" "Not." "Are you eating?" "Not." "Do you need help with the arrangements?" "Not." "How are you holding up? The man who raised you just died." The estate. 3 days after his death, before his body was even in the ground, and my mother's first real question was about the money. "There's an attorney handling things," I said. "Her name is Marian Voss." "An attorney? Already?" The surprise in her voice was genuine. She hadn't expected Henry to plan ahead. She'd expected a confused old rancher with a handshake estate and a family that could argue its way to a split. She was wrong about all of it, but she didn't know that yet. "We'll be there Saturday," she said. "We should all sit down together as a family." Family. That word, from her mouth, after 20 years of absence, it tasted like rust. Marian Voss drove out to the ranch on Friday morning. She was in her mid-50s, gray-streaked hair pulled back, wearing a barn jacket over a blouse like she'd dressed for both a law office and a ranch visit. She carried a leather portfolio and a sealed envelope. We sat at the kitchen table. "Henry retained me 8 years ago," she said. "He was methodical about this. Everything is in order." She opened the portfolio and showed me the basic structure. A trust, the details of which she said would be read formally after the funeral in the presence of all relevant parties. She couldn't share specifics yet. Then she placed the envelope on the table. "He asked me to give you this before the reading. He was very specific about the timing." The envelope was plain white, sealed with tape. My name written on the front in Henry's blocky engineer's handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, the kind he tore from the yellow legal pads he used for sketching. 3 sentences. "Stay calm, let them talk. The paperwork already speaks." That was it. No explanation of the trust, no list of assets, no instructions on how to handle my parents. Just Henry, distilled into 3 lines, telling me the same thing he'd been telling me since I was 9 years old. "The work is already done. Your job is to stand there and let it hold." I folded the letter and put it in my jacket pocket, next to the ring. Marian watched me with steady eyes. "He knew they'd come," she said quietly. "He planned for it." I nodded. Of course he did. Henry Ashford built things that held up under pressure. He always had. They arrived Saturday morning at 10, Diane, Glenn, and Brian, in a rented black SUV that looked like it cost more per day than Glenn used to make in a week. I watched from the kitchen window as they pulled up the gravel drive. Diane stepped out first, sunglasses on, black dress, heels entirely wrong for a ranch. Glenn followed in a dark suit that didn't quite fit. He'd either lost weight or bought it cheap. And then Brian. My brother was 22 now, tall, sandy-haired, wearing a peacoat and the expression of someone who'd been told this trip would be short and profitable. I hadn't seen him since I was 9. He looked like Glenn around the jaw, like Diane around the eyes. He looked like a stranger. They didn't come to the door first. They walked the property. Diane pointed at the barn, the pastures, the equipment shed. Glenn had his phone out, and I could see him tapping, taking notes, or calculating, or both. Brian stood by the paddock fence and looked at the horses the way someone looks at a used car they're considering. They walked the perimeter like buyers at an open house. 20 minutes of appraising my grandfather's life before they knocked on his front door. When I opened it, Diane pulled me into a hug I didn't return. "Oh, sweetheart, look at you." Over her shoulder, I heard Glenn's phone buzz. He silenced it, but not before I caught the caller ID, Pacific Collections, debt collector. Glenn Mercer hadn't come to Oregon to grieve. He'd come because he was drowning, and my grandfather's estate looked like a life raft. They all had. They just had different names for it. They didn't wait long. That evening, after the casserole the neighbor brought was half-eaten and the small talk had run dry, Diane sat down across from me at the kitchen table and folded her hands. It was her boardroom pose. I'd seen it exactly once, at a family dinner when I was 7, when she was arguing with Henry about money. "Iris, we need to talk about your grandfather's estate." "There's a formal reading scheduled," I said, "after the funeral." "I understand that. But as family, we should discuss expectations." Family. There it was again. What expectations? Diane looked at Glenn, who leaned against the counter with his arms crossed. "This property," Glenn said. "The land, the horses, whatever patents your grandfather held. We've done some research. It's substantial." "How substantial?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "North of 100 million, Glenn said. He said it like he was reading a stock ticker. "Your mother is Henry's only surviving child. We have a reasonable expectation of inheritance." Diane reached across the table and put her hand on mine. "Sweetheart, we're your parents. Grandpa would want his family taken care of. All of us. Together." I looked at her hand on mine. Manicured nails. A ring I didn't recognize. Cubic zirconia trying to pass for diamond. This was the hand that hadn't waved goodbye from the Buick. "You didn't share me," I said. My voice was level. I wasn't angry. That would come later if it came at all. I was just accurate. "You left me here for 10 years. You didn't share holidays, birthdays, or phone calls. Why would you share this?" Diane pulled her hand back. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Glenn's jaw tightened. Nobody answered. I drove to Bend the next morning and sat across from Marion Voss in her office. "They're here," I said. "They want the estate." I expected that. Marion opened a file on her desk. "I can't discuss the specific terms of the trust with you before the formal reading." Henry was clear about that. Everyone hears it at the same time. "Can you tell me if it's solid?" She looked at me over her glasses. "Your grandfather spent 8 years and considerable resources building this structure. He consulted 3 independent attorneys. He had his competency formally evaluated twice, once when the trust was created, and again 18 months before his death. Both evaluations are documented and witnessed." She paused. "Iris, your grandfather was an engineer. He didn't build things that fall apart." "They'll challenge it," I said. "They'll say he was confused, or that I influenced him." "They can say whatever they'd like. Saying it and proving it in court are 2 very different things." She closed the file. "My advice? Say nothing. Let the document do it." It was the same thing Henry had written in his letter. The paperwork already speaks. I wanted more. Wanted to see the numbers, the clauses, the architecture of whatever Henry had constructed. But Marion held the line, and I respected it. This was Henry's system. He'd designed it, tested it, and put it in the hands of a professional he trusted. My job was to let it run. I drove back to the ranch with the windows down, Henry's ring heavy on my thumb, the smell of juniper and sage filling the cab. I didn't know what was in that trust, but I knew the man who built it, and that was enough to sleep on. Brian found me in the workshop that afternoon. I was organizing Henry's tools, not because they needed organizing, but because the smell of saddle leather and machine oil calmed me down, and I needed calm. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking at the pegboard walls and the workbench like he was visiting a museum. "So this is where he spent all his time," Brian said. "This is where we spent all our time," I corrected. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "They told me you were the difficult one." I didn't look up from the wrench set I was sorting. "Did they?" "Yeah. Mom said you had behavioral issues, that Grandpa offered to take you because you needed structure." He paused. "But this place doesn't look like a punishment." I set down a socket wrench and turned to face him. Brian was 22, and up close he looked tired. Not road tired, life tired. The kind of tired you get from growing up in a house where the money was always almost gone and the stories kept changing. For 1 second, I saw something in his face that looked like doubt. Like the version of me he'd been told about for 13 years didn't match the woman standing in a workshop full of precision tools. It was the closest thing to an honest moment we'd ever have. Then it passed. "Look," he said, straightening up. "I just want to make sure the reading is fair. Mom and Dad have been through a lot. Dad's business went under. We lost the house in Portland. They need this." "They need this," I repeated. "Yeah," he said. "They need it." He left the workshop, and the doubt I'd seen in his face was gone, replaced by the math of desperation. The funeral was held at the community church in town, a white clapboard building with a steeple that Henry had helped re-roof 12 years earlier. The pews were full. Ranch hands in clean jeans and pressed shirts, the hardware store owner, the vet who'd made weekend house calls, the county clerk, the woman from the feed store. Half the town had come because Henry Ashford had been the kind of man who showed up for other people, and other people remembered. Diane and Glenn sat in the front row, positioned like principals at a board meeting. Diane wore black silk and a practiced expression of sorrow, lower lip trembling just enough to be visible, tissue clutched in one hand, the other resting on Glenn's arm. Glenn stared straight ahead with the look of a man doing math in his head. Brian sat at the end of the pew, arms crossed, checking his phone under his thigh. I sat across the aisle with Marion Voss and two of Henry's oldest ranch hands, Dale and Pete, both in their 60s, both men who'd worked the property for over a decade. The pastor spoke about Henry's generosity, his quiet faith, his commitment to the land. Then he opened the floor. Diane stood up. She walked to the front of the church, tissue in hand, and delivered a 3-minute eulogy about a father she hadn't visited in 15 years. She talked about his gentle wisdom. She talked about family bonds that distance couldn't break. She talked about how much she'd sacrificed being apart from him. The ranch hands in the back row exchanged a look I caught from the corner of my eye. Dale leaned over to Pete and whispered something. I didn't need to hear it. Everyone in that church knew who had actually been here and who had not. After the service, people gathered in the church fellowship hall for coffee and sandwiches. I was standing by the window when I saw Diane working the room. She moved from group to group, touching arms, lowering her voice, leaning in close. I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the body language. She was planting something. I found out what it was 20 minutes later when Mrs. Harmon, the postmaster's wife, approached me with a careful expression. "Iris, honey, your mother mentioned that Henry's mind wasn't quite right toward the end. She said you were handling all his finances?" "I wasn't handling his finances," I said. "He had an attorney for that." "Oh." She made it sound like... Mrs. Harmon trailed off, embarrassed. I understood then what Diane was doing. She was building a narrative, not for the courtroom, not yet, but for the court of public opinion. Confused old man, vulnerable, isolated on a ranch with a granddaughter who handled everything. The word she wanted people to think but wouldn't say out loud: undue influence. The irony was thick enough to choke on. The woman who had abandoned her father for 2 decades was now painting herself as the concerned daughter worried about his cognitive decline. The woman who had never once asked about his medications, his doctor's appointments, his daily life, was suddenly an expert on his mental state. And the people she was telling this to, The people who had actually been here, who had watched Henry sharpen his own tools and balance his own books and argue water rights policy at town council meetings until 6 months before he died. They weren't buying it. But Diane didn't know that yet. Right here is where most people would scream. I didn't. My grandfather taught me the quiet ones win on paper. If you've ever wished you'd stayed calm and let the truth land on its own, you'll want to see what the lawyer pulled out next. Comment if you're Team Iris, and subscribe so the ending finds you. Glenn cornered me in the church parking lot. He'd loosened his tie and had the look of a man who'd been rehearsing a speech. "We've retained legal counsel," he said, "just to make sure the process is transparent." "What process?" "The estate distribution. The reading of whatever document your grandfather left behind." He said, "whatever document," like it was a napkin note, not a decade of deliberate legal architecture. "We have concerns," he continued, "about capacity, about influence. Henry was elderly and isolated, and you were his sole caretaker for the last year. Any attorney would flag that." I looked at him. My father. The man who'd carried my suitcase to the porch and driven away without looking back. Now he was standing in a parking lot using words like capacity and influence to describe the man who'd raised his daughter. "You're going to argue that Grandpa was confused," I said. "We're going to argue that the process should be fair," Glenn corrected. "And if it's not, we'll challenge it. Oregon law gives family standing to contest a will or trust on grounds of undue influence or diminished capacity." He'd memorized that from a website. I could tell by the rhythm. It sounded like a Google result, not a thought. "File whatever you want," I said. "There's a formal reading Monday morning. Everyone will hear the same thing at the same time. We'll be bringing our attorney. Bring whoever you want." I turned and walked to my truck. My hands were steady. My voice had been even. But inside I was running the numbers the way Henry taught me, calculating loads, testing for points of failure, figuring out where the structure might crack. If they filed, I needed to know the foundation was solid. I already believed it was. Monday would prove it. I didn't sleep much that night. I sat in the workshop, Henry's ring on my thumb, breathing in the smell of saddle leather and machine oil, and thought about what my grandfather would do. The answer was obvious. He wouldn't argue in a parking lot. He wouldn't match their volume. He wouldn't call a family meeting to hash it out over emotions and accusations. He'd let the system he built do its job. "You don't inherit a thing," he'd told me in this same room, under this same work light. "You earn the right to keep it." Diane and Glenn wanted a fight. They wanted chaos. The kind of messy, emotional family brawl where the loudest person wins because nobody can remember who said what. That was their arena. Documents weren't. I made my decision. I wouldn't confront them again before the reading. I wouldn't explain, defend, or negotiate. I would show up on Monday, sit in a chair, and let Marion Voss read every word Henry had put on paper in front of every person in the room. If the system held, and I believed it would, then the arguments would die on contact with the facts. If it didn't, I'd deal with that too. But I wasn't going to give Diane and Glenn the satisfaction of seeing me sweat. Henry had handed me 3 tools: a letter, a ring, and 10 years of building things that work. The letter said stay calm. The ring said keep what matters. And the 10 years said trust the design, even when the load gets heavy. I locked up the workshop, walked across the dark yard past the windmill, turning slow in the November wind, and went to bed. Monday was coming. The paperwork would speak. Sunday night, I sat on the porch with Henry's letter unfolded on my knee. The paper was already soft at the creases from handling. Stay calm. Let them talk. The paperwork already speaks. 3 sentences. The man had reduced an entire estate strategy to 3 sentences because that's how engineers think. Strip it down to what carries the load, discard the rest. The ring was on my thumb, warm from my skin. I turned it and felt the inscription press against my finger. March 14th, 1962. Ashford Keeps. I thought about what Henry had said the night he put it in my hand. Keep it where they can see. I'd been wearing it since he died, but I hadn't understood the instruction. Now I thought I did. It wasn't about showing off. It was about identification, about standing in a room and being recognizable as the person who'd been there, who'd worked, who'd stayed. The windmill turned behind the barn, its creak muffled by the distance but still there. A rhythm I'd known for 20 years, the heartbeat of a property I'd helped rebuild with my own hands. I thought about all the nights I'd lain awake in the room upstairs, 9 years old, 10, 11, 12, listening to that creak and wondering if my parents were listening to anything at all. They weren't. They never had been. But Henry had been listening the whole time. To the ranch, to the wind, to me. And he'd been building, quietly, the way he always built. Precise, tested, unannounced. Whatever was in that trust, it was Henry's last design, and tomorrow, everyone was going to see it. I folded the letter, put it back in my pocket, and went inside. The windmill kept turning. The ring stayed on. Monday morning, 9 o'clock. The reading took place in the ranch house living room, Henry's choice, Marion told me. He wanted it here, not in an office. The room was the biggest in the house. High ceiling, wood-paneled walls, windows facing the east pastures. Marion had arranged 6 chairs in a semicircle facing a small table where she sat with the portfolio and a notarized document. I arrived first and took the chair nearest the window. Dale and Pete came next. Henry had named them as witnesses to the reading, which Marion said he'd specified in writing. Then came Frank Beaulieu, Henry's oldest friend, a retired large animal vet who'd known him for 40 years. He shook my hand and sat down without a word. At 9:15, the front door opened. Diane entered first, wearing a charcoal suit and an expression of composed entitlement. Glenn followed, adjusting his cuffs. Behind them was a man I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, sharp suit, leather briefcase. Their attorney. Brian came last, hands in his pockets, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. They took the remaining chairs. The room was silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and, if you listened closely, the faint creak of the windmill outside. Marion looked around the room, confirming everyone was present. "Thank you for being here," she said. "This is the formal reading of the Henry Ashford Revocable Living Trust, which upon Mr. Ashford's death became irrevocable under Oregon law. I will read the relevant provisions in full. I ask that all questions be held until the end." Diane's attorney opened his briefcase and took out a legal pad. Glenn sat forward. Diane folded her hands in her lap, the boardroom pose, and Marion Voss opened the document. Marion read slowly, clearly, the way you read something that was built to be heard. The Henry Ashford Revocable Living Trust, dated January 12, 2006, amended July 2013, hereby irrevocable upon the death of the settler, provides as follows. She started with the preamble, standard language, formation under Oregon revised statutes, trustee designations. Then she got to the distributions. All trust assets, including but not limited to, the real property known as Ashford Stables, comprising 1,142 acres in Harney County, Oregon. All water rights appurtenant thereto, the personal property located thereon, and the full portfolio of 14 United States patents held by the settler, together valued at approximately $104 million, are distributed solely and irrevocably to the following beneficiary. She paused. The room was silent. Iris May Ashford. I felt every pair of eyes in the room land on me. Diane's head turned. Glenn's mouth opened. Brian sat back in his chair like he'd been shoved. The settler further directs, Marion continued, that the following individuals are intentionally excluded from any distribution under this trust, and that this exclusion is not an oversight, but a deliberate decision made with full knowledge and sound judgment. She read the names. Diane Marie Mercer, born Ashford. Glenn Robert Mercer. Brian Allen Mercer. Then she read the stated reasons. 1 sentence per person, drafted in Henry's dry, precise language. For Diane. My daughter Diane abandoned her minor child in my care in August 2007 and made no meaningful effort to parent, visit, or support said child in the years following. For Glenn. Glenn Mercer participated in and facilitated the abandonment described above. For Brian, Henry had been gentler. Brian Mercer bears no personal fault but was not raised in connection with this property or its values, and is provided for separately below. Diane's face was the color of paper. Glenn had stopped breathing, and their attorney's pen had stopped moving on the legal pad. Marian wasn't finished. The trust further contains the following provisions, she said. First, a no-contest clause under Oregon law. Any beneficiary or excluded party who contests the validity of this trust by any legal means forfeits any right to the token distributions described in Schedule B. She looked up. Schedule B provides a one-time payment of $5,000 to each excluded party, contingent on non-contest. A challenge eliminates even that amount. Glenn's attorney put down his pen. He knew what this meant. A no-contest clause wasn't just a warning, it was a wall. Contest and lose, and you walk away with nothing. But the next part was the real architecture. Second, Marian continued, the settler's testamentary capacity is attested by the following: a cognitive evaluation performed by Dr. Rebecca Stahl, MD, licensed psychiatrist, dated January 2006, at the time of trust formation. A second evaluation by Dr. Stahl, dated April 2013, 18 months prior to death, and witnessed attestations by two independent attorneys, Thomas Brandt of Portland and Carol Kimura of Eugene, both present at the signing and amendment. She let that settle. 3 independent professionals, 2 evaluations over 7 years, 2 outside attorneys who had no stake in the outcome. Any argument that Henry Ashford was confused, coerced, or manipulated would have to survive a wall of documentation that he'd been building since before his granddaughter left for college. Glenn's diminished capacity argument, the one he'd rehearsed from a legal website, was dead. Diane's undue influence narrative, the one she'd been whispering at the funeral, was dead. They had come to this room with assumptions and entitlement and a hired attorney, and they had run into 8 years of meticulous planning by a man who built irrigation systems that lasted 40 years and prepared for the exact ambush they were attempting. The color hadn't returned to Diane's face. Glenn was staring at the floor. Their attorney was very, very quiet. The silence lasted about 8 seconds. Then Diane stood up. Her chair scraped against the hardwood floor, a sharp, ugly sound in the quiet room, and her composure cracked open like a dam giving way. "This is insane," she said. Her voice was high and thin, the performance tone gone. This was the real Diane. "He can't do this. He can't leave everything. $100 million. To her." She pointed at me. "She was a child when she came here. She was nothing. We gave her to him because we didn't have a choice." "You had a choice," Dale said from his chair. He said it quietly, the way ranch people say things that aren't up for debate. Diane ignored him. She turned to their attorney. "Do something. Object. File something." The attorney looked at her with the expression of a man who'd just realized his retainer wasn't going to cover this. "Mrs. Mercer, the documentation is extensive. A contest on capacity grounds would be extremely difficult to sustain, given the evaluations and witness attestations." "Then find something else." She was shaking now. Glenn reached for her arm and she pulled away. Brian was staring at the table. And then it came. The sentence that had been living in Diane's chest for 10 years, the truth she'd papered over with silence and distance, and the occasional phone call about money. She turned to me, eyes wet, jaw tight, and said it in front of every person in that room. "You are the one we could afford to lose." The room went still. Not quiet. Still. Dale closed his eyes. Pete looked at the floor. Frank Beaulieu, Henry's oldest friend, shook his head slowly. Marian didn't move. And I sat in my chair by the window with Henry's ring on my thumb and felt the weight of a sentence I'd first heard through a car window when I was 9 years old, now spoken again, 10 years later, in front of witnesses who would never forget it. I didn't stand up. I didn't raise my voice. I sat in the chair Henry had placed by the window of the house he'd built with his own hands, and I looked at my mother, and I kept my answer short. He already said no, in writing. The room exhaled. Marian nodded. a small professional nod, and continued. There is one additional personal provision I'm directed to read. She turned to a page near the end of the document. To my granddaughter Iris, to whom I gave my father's ring on the night of November 11th. This ring, bearing the inscription Ashford Keeps and the date March 14th, 1962, is both a personal inheritance and a confirmation of intent. I gave it to Iris because she is the person who stayed, who worked, and who earned the right to carry this name. Let the presence of this ring on her hand stand as testament that my wishes were communicated directly, personally, and without coercion. I was of sound mind. I was not influenced. I was proud. Marian looked up. I was holding my right hand steady on the arm of the chair, the ring visible. March 14th, 1962. Ashford Keeps. That's what "keep it where they can see" meant. Not a display, a receipt. Proof of delivery, engineer's style, documented, witnessed, specific. Glenn's head was down. His attorney was packing his briefcase. Brian hadn't moved, hadn't spoken. He was staring at the ring on my hand with an expression I couldn't read. Maybe anger, maybe shame, maybe the slow dawn of understanding that the parents who'd kept him had been lying about everything. Diane stood frozen by her chair, tissue crumpled in her fist. The tears on her face no longer performed. She'd said the quiet part out loud, and the room had heard it, and no amount of revision would take it back. Henry Ashford, from beyond the grave, had built his final machine, and it worked exactly the way he designed it. The reading ended at 9:52. Marian closed the portfolio, thanked the witnesses, and offered to answer individual questions by appointment. The formal part was over in under an hour. Glenn's attorney was the first to leave. He shook Glenn's hand at the door, said something about reviewing options, and walked to his car at a pace that suggested he already knew there were no options worth reviewing. A contest would trigger the no contest clause, vaporizing even the $5,000 token gift. A capacity challenge would slam into 2 psychiatric evaluations and 2 independent attorney attestations. An undue influence claim would require proving that I, a college student who'd been living 3 hours away, had somehow controlled a man whose own doctor had certified his sharp cognitive function 18 months prior. There was no angle. Henry had sealed every seam. Glenn followed the attorney out without looking at me. Diane lingered. She stood in the center of the living room, clutching her purse, her eyes moving across the walls, the windows, the mantel where Henry's engineering awards still sat in their frames. She was looking at the house the way she'd looked at the property on Saturday, like a buyer who'd just been told the sale was off. "This isn't over," she said to no one in particular. But it was. She knew it. I knew it. Every person in that room knew it. Diane walked out. Brian was last. He stopped at the door and looked back at me. One long look. Unreadable. Then he put his hands in his pockets and followed his parents to the rented SUV. The engine started. The gravel crunched. And the car disappeared down the same road it had arrived on. The same road the Buick had taken 10 years earlier. I stayed in my chair. The ring was warm. The windmill turned outside. The house was quiet. They never filed. Glenn's attorney sent a single letter to Marian Voss 2 weeks after the reading, a half-hearted inquiry about mediation options that Marian responded to with a 3-line summary of the no contest clause, the capacity attestations, and a polite invitation to proceed through the courts if they wished. The letter was never answered. The $5,000 token payment sat uncollected for the statutory period and then reverted to the trust. I don't know what happened to Glenn's debts. I don't know whether Diane ever told the truth to whoever she'd whispered to at the funeral. I don't know what Brian believed by the time he got back to Portland, whether he held on to the story his parents had told him, or whether the version of me he'd seen in that workshop had planted something he couldn't dislodge. He never reached out. None of them did. I didn't sell the ranch. Henry hadn't asked me to, and even if he had, I wouldn't have. Ashford stables kept running. Dale and Pete stayed on, and I hired 2 more hands and a part-time vet to handle the growing boarding operation. I finished my engineering degree remotely, launched my company from the workshop where Henry had taught me to solder, and filed 3 more patents in the first 2 years. But the thing I'm proudest of isn't the company. 18 months after the reading, I established the Henry Ashford Hope Foundation, Henry's Hope, for short. It provides trade apprenticeships, housing support, and mentorship for young people aging out of the foster care system. The ranch hosts a summer program every July. 8 kids, 6 weeks.